Hello and welcome back to series on learning about the division with Superintendent Annalie Nutter. That's me. This is session number 3 and I'm happy to have you back. Thank you. If you weren't able to see session 1 and 2, I encourage you to go back to our YouTube site where you can see both those videos and get the information that we presented, and we will continue to upload things here for you. Today we're going to focus on the budget, and so I'm happy to have you here. Thank you. All right, so as I already mentioned, this is the budget discussion, and we're going to focus on funding today. I do in fact have a huge list of what we will be talking about when it comes to budget, and I've called it Budget 101. This is a huge learning category. So I've outlined what I think are the major areas that you'll be interested in or that you need to know in order to answer some questions that you might have. As usual, you can ask those questions, as I mentioned. If you can't get through on the link, please feel free to email me as well. It helps us to see what exactly it is you need to know, and it helps us understand where maybe you aren't understanding clearly, and so we can give you that clarity. Like I said, we likely will not get through everything in a really deep manner today, as the budget is very complex, but some of these subtopics you'll see will have more detailed explanations. So I hope you bear with me when we do this. I think it's important to help you and me as the new superintendent to understand the budget and how the current funding model is not working as well as we would like. So today, where do we get our funding from and how is it dispersed? The next section will be what does it get spent on, and then how is it allocated to schools, and then we have 3 other questions there. We'll get through as much as we can, but like I said, I don't want to overwhelm you and turn you off and make you run away from this screen because it's a lot of complex information. So last time we had some questions that came through, and I always answer the questions first. I'm going to highlight 2 of those questions that we had, and this is the first question. What did the plan, and that refers to the education plan, what did the education plan implement for access to supports and services? Composite High School has a minimum of 16 coded kids in a specialized program, and they have community outings, no options like swimming as they did for years, and there are many people locally looking for work as an EA and they are not hired. Coded kids in the life skills program are not getting the true meaning of life skills. They're short staffed, they're short teachers, they're not getting the community outing options of swimming, and they get funding, so they're considered tier 1 students in my mind. So that came in from a viewer, and we appreciate it. Thank you so much. We are very happy to get these questions. I would like to review in a basic way, because we're going to be delving deeper into things today about some of these questions, some parts of this question. And then later on, we will also be looking deeper into just the specialized supports piece as well related to budget. So the number of students that are enrolled in the life skills program is growing. This is actually the first year that we've had 2 classrooms. So now we have 2 classrooms, we need 2 teachers. And so we're seeing an increase in the overall needs of the student support that's required. And so the budget was used to just get another teacher, basically. And if there was new students that came in and required more support, an educational assistant or 2 might have happened to be part of that program. So some of the money goes there. Community outings have been affected by COVID, but also impacted by staff illnesses and short staffing, which is not just an issue in Fort McMurray Public Schools. It's actually an issue across the country and probably, I'm guessing, across the world. So there is a plan to return to swimming again in some kind of rotating schedule. So we have to just figure out what that staffing will look like for scheduling. And then funding for students is based on several sources of funding, and a clear clear pupil amount can't be calculated easily. And I can share that funding in this area is at a deficit. So we always spend more than we have in the area of inclusive learning. And I will get into more details that will probably answer your question further once we get further into it today. But like I said, if we had to hire 2 teachers instead of 1, that's double the cost. And the average cost for a teacher is $107,000. And then if it was an educational assistant, the average cost there is about $55,000. So you can see how it quickly adds up. Also, busing for special needs students is at a higher cost, I guess you could say, because it's not that the bus costs more, it's just that there's less students on the bus. And so those students taking the bus the funding that's given for them is not paying for the bus. All right, question number 2. Does the money given to you for coded students actually go to them directly? Break down the funding for the Vulnerable at Composite Life Skills program. Why do they not have a life skills program? Education required to transition to adulthood. So the simple answer is yes, but the funding we get is allocated in a very complex way, which I will show you tonight. It's not a simple dollar amount per student at all. The budget is based on multiple formulas that they use. We're allocated funding by the government, which we in turn allocate based on the grants that we're given. And for the special needs students in the division, this is based on a division needs assessment. So as you heard me say in the response previous to this question, we're really never fully funded and always in a deficit in multiple areas, including inclusive learning. It's important to note that the current funding model used by the government is based on a 3-year average per student, which lags, so it's behind. So we're never fully funded for the most current year's number of students. And I'll explain this further tonight. Alrighty, so let's get on. Those are the only 2 questions we had, so we're going to move on to the content for tonight. Who tells us how to spend our money? Well, of course, everybody knows that we get our money from the Government of Alberta Ministry of Education. And they actually issue a funding manual which describes all of the ways that they calculate how they are funding the divisions. And this is according to legislation in the Education Act, the Government Org Act, all of those 5 listed right there in front of you. So there are reasons why they do it and regulations that they follow when they're doing this and creating the funding manual. So where does the money come from? A further dip into, this is just the Ministry of Education. Essentially, we get our money from the Treasury Board and Finance originally, which is given to the Ministry of Education. And they create a method to do this, considering the needs as a province in their business plans. And these are then mandated by the Premier to the Minister of Education. And they have a business plan for education. So here's a chart from the February budget, and some of you might have seen this before. This is what the Government of Alberta put out in February, and you can see how they break down the funding to different categories. So we've got the ministry support services, instruction, operations and maintenance, student transportation, school facilities, governance and system admin, program support services, and then private schools. And then if we look at the shaded gray column, that tells you how many millions each of those categories were budgeted. This again would be based on what they've determined along with the Ministry of Education as the needs likely based on the student population in order to meet their goals in the Ministry of Education. So the biggest chunk of the money goes to instruction in kindergarten to grade 12. $6 billion, $6.5 billion. And then next would be operations and maintenance with $737 million. And then would be student transportation with $386 million, followed by governance and administration with followed by private schools with $317 million, then governance and administration with $276 million, and program support services with $109, and then rounding out the back end is school facilities and ministry support services at $6 million each. So I've created a pie for you. When you cut that budget up and think of it as a pie, this is what it looks like for the province. This is for Alberta Education. This is not for Fort McMurray Public. So you can see there, it's just a better representation of how much of that pie actually goes to instruction versus governance versus student transportation. And I just want to point out that the orange section didn't get a label or a line drawn to it for whatever reasons in the program that I'm using. That is the program supports at 109 million. I just couldn't get it to show up, sorry. And interesting or not interesting, but I guess a thing to comment on here would be that the budget for COVID is a one-time budget this year of $13 million for the entire province. So that more than likely will not be there next year. And so that money is then divided up to the school divisions through a very complex model. And they provide school divisions with a funding manual, which is a picture there on the screen in front of you, of the funding manual, which outlines the details of everything. And I've gone through it to try to demonstrate some of the complexity to you. But even some things I was looking at, I had to go in and get assistance from the Associate Superintendent of Business and Finance to let me know and help me understand better. So it's very complicated. It's based on formulas and funding rates and criteria and all kinds of fun stuff. So I'm going to try and explain it as best I can without boring you. Please, I would grab a piece of paper and a pen where you could ask your questions as we go. So record them as we go, and then later you can put them into the Google Doc, or you might find that I answer your question as we go tonight. And then once you submit them, like I said, at the beginning of the next session, we can answer them, and I will consult where I need to. You're free to go and find this funding manual yourself. It's available online if you're keen to see it. You just have to Google Alberta Funding Manual for School Authorities. Okay, are you ready? Fasten your seatbelts because this is going to be a wild ride. Alberta's funding model consists of 15 major grant allocations. So if you think back to that pie, and I've got it there in the bottom left-hand corner, that's the pie that the government creates for themselves. That is the pie that the ministry gets from the government of Alberta. When they get that pie, they have more people to share it with, so they have to cut it into more pieces. And that is the boxes you are seeing in front of you, the blue boxes. So base instruction is that big green piece of the pie, but we're going to now split it into 3 different parts. And then supports and services is going to get split into 5 different parts, etc., etc., etc. So nothing is simple. It's very complex calculations, in my opinion. I will do my best to explain, and at the end, I'll show you what your division pie looks like. Similar to how I showed you this provincial pie. So the very first piece of pie is base instruction, and you'll see that I've crossed something out on that, and that is rural small schools, because that is not us. So we aren't eligible for that piece of the pie. So that's already something that's taken away from us or is not for us. This year, the government has increased the funding in base instruction by 1% for kindergarten to grade 12. The new funding model doesn't allocate funding per student or per school like it used to. Instead, it uses an average enrollment to allocate the funding for educational activities of the entire division. So I'm going to repeat that again. The new funding model does not allocate funding per student or per school like it used to. Instead, it uses an average enrollment through a formula to allocate the funding for education. So they look at the average enrollment and attach a dollar figure based on that average enrollment. This is important because it's only been in place since the 2020-2021 school year. We're not being funded like we used to be, but also the funding that we're getting never fully funds us for the number of students that we currently have. I'll repeat that line. We are never getting fully funded for the number of students that are currently in the system, and I'll explain that more in a minute. If you recall nothing from this session, I hope you remember that the most. The funding model, in our opinion, is not working for us as a growing school division. which has only increased enrollment since 2017, except for 1 year, 2020. Every year since 2017, we have grown in enrollment. And this means that there are unfunded students every year, since the funding is lagging based on the average number calculation. You will see some dollar amounts on the screen here. To the right of ECS in grades 1 to 9, you see some dollar amounts. That is the amount that they take as a base amount, and then they multiply it by this average enrollment number. So let's say we, in ECS, which is kindergarten, we had, in the division, we had 400 students. They would multiply 400 students times this amount, and that would be the base amount for kindergarten in the whole division. Okay, so these numbers, again, are not per student. And you need to keep that in mind. So I'm going to go into some more details now. All right, here's what we have, what we call the weighted moving average. And you're probably saying, what is that? Well, again, this is not per student funding like it used to be. Using the weighted moving average, they calculate the enrollment and the funds are given based on that. And they average it over 3 years, just like in the chart. And the charts keep rolling, will keep rolling as the years go by. So if you look at that chart there in front of you, the first year was 2020, 2021. The next year, and so we're only in 2022, 23 right now. This is our third year using this weighted moving average. Okay, this is our third year. Let me show you an example using our actual data. Here we go. This equates to a lot of lost dollars. Yes, it does. And I'll explain that in a second. So if you look at the numbers, in the 2020-21 school year, we had 6,355 students, and we are asked to multiply that number by 20% to get our first bit of enrollment data. So when we do that, we get 1,271 students. Then we're told to go look at our 21-22 school year, where we had 6,729 students. Multiply that by 30%, and here is the number you will get for that, 2019. That is not the year, that is the actual number, 2019. And then for the third year, which is this year, we want you to take a guess at what your numbers are going to be and multiply that by 50%. So this is just an example. 7249, that was our guess. Multiply by 50, here's the enrollment number. And then you add those three together to get your average. And so it averages out to 6,914 students. But we actually had this year and have currently and are growing still 7,249 students. But they're only giving us money based on this number. So that means there are 335 students that are unfunded, basically, that we are educating. Yes, we did get a new grant this year called the Supplemental Growth Grant, which was to cover that growth because we grew by 8.1% this year, which we weren't expecting. We expected 4% and we doubled that. Even with that Supplemental Growth Grant, we are still unfunded for 119 students, which equates to about $1.5 million. It's underfunded. That supplemental grant gave us $1,500 on any growth we had between 2 and 5%. And then it gave us $3,000 on any growth greater than 5%. But that is not our current student count. There was no growth grant for any growth between 0 and 2%. And these growth grants help, but they don't replace the full funding for the actual enrollment. Will you agree with me now? This is very complex, and I'm trying to keep it as simple as I can and give you just the bare minimum of what you need to understand this. There's all kinds of fine print when it comes to funding all the special needs students and such, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. I just wanted to show you this to let you know that for grades kindergarten to 9, they take that number and multiply it by that rate. So I'm going to flip back just so you can see the number for ECS was $3,062. So what they're going to do is take $3,062, that's the base instructor rate, multiply it by the average number of students in kindergarten. And that's going to be how they fund for kindergarten students. And they'll do the same thing for grades 1 to 9. It's very complex. I don't know how else to say it. Here's high school's a little bit different when they calculate. So it gets even more complicated because we have those students who are in grade 10, 11, 12, and then they graduate. They get funded 100%. But if there's students that come back to, say, our outreach school, they only get funded for half of that. And if they're in their fifth year or more, they get funded at 25%. So this has a very large impact on our outreach school at Frank Spraggins because the 4th and 5th year students are funded at a reduced rate. And many of these students are in those years of education in high school. So for example, last year, we had 150 grade 10 to 12s at Frank Spraggins. 20 of them were in their 5th year and funded at 25%. 53 were in their 4th year and funded at 50%. So again, not fully funded. And this is over and above the impact of the weighted moving average. All right, we're on to our second piece of pie. Grants and services and supports category. And within that, there are 5 pieces that we need to divide up. The first one is called specialized learning supports, and that's for kindergarten to grade 12. And this is comprised of 3 allocations. The first one, and this is to support students who are unique in the way that they are approaching competencies and developing those foundational competencies. So it supports the school division in the provision of a continuum of supports and services for these students. And these are those students with learning needs that are higher than others, and are in our inclusive learning environment. So 1, 2, 3 labeled right there in front of you. These 3 allocations make up part of the specialized learning support. So the first one is called multidisciplinary supports. This is to help build capacity and support for specialized assessments, things like helping teachers and educational assistants and other professionals to better understand and adapt to students' unique needs. And you can see a formula there. And I am so sorry to inundate you with formulas, but I need you to see how complex it is. So for students that fall under that category, the base funding would be $5,000, and then we would multiply it by the weighted moving average. And there's a special factor that the government puts in there as well, which is not clearly defined. Then they add another $368.26 multiplied by the weighted moving average and another factor. So that is how they calculate the dollars for that. Then there's something called the jurisdiction composition, which is to address inclusive learning needs that might vary between school divisions. So maybe one school division has a higher immigrant population than another. Maybe another school division has a higher number of students with disabilities that are getting support through FCSD. So that's a different situation. So it gives us a proportion based on those factors. So there's the government factor. It's called the jurisdiction composition factor. And they multiply it by a provincial allocation, and we get funding there. And then finally, there's something called the Student Wellness Program. The Student Wellness Program is to support capacity in school authorities to be able to offer things like mental wellness. I guess you could call it mental wellness or mental health and gaps in learning to improve the outcomes for all students. And so you can see the base amount is $5,000 times a government factor, which wasn't clear. And then they add a total provincial allocation and multiply that by another factor called the Student Wellness Proportion Allocation. And they get an amount for that. Do you see how hard this is? And a reminder that these are not per student. They are a rate based on the weighted moving average, which is from the previous 3 years. As a school division, we have a needs assessment that happens in the early spring so that we can determine, now that we have this pot of money or this pocket of money for this area, then we do that needs assessment and we determine, okay, what do we need? What do our students need? Okay, here's the resource money we have for that. And we match the resources and allocate the best that we can. Below that, you'll see there's a grant for severe kindergarten and one for moderate language delay for kindergarten. And they're funded a little bit differently. The weighted moving average of kindergarten students identified with needs multiplied by 15,000. And then the weighted moving average of kindergarten students identified with needs multiplied by 10,000. That's because this is not as severe of a delay. And when you think about it, if I told you earlier that an educational assistant costs between $50,000 and $55,000 a year, if you have, let's say you have 10 of these, you would need 10 of these students just to get one EA. Well, sorry, my math's not that great. You'd need about 3.5 of these students in order to get one EA. And the dollar amounts will be broken down further, like I said. For ECDP, which are students who are referred to us who are 2 years old, and they get referred to us through Alberta Health Services. We don't accept students without those referrals. When they come, they get very similar funding. Okay, so we've talked about specialized learning support. We've talked about PUF, which is the pre-K, and now we're going on to ESL, francization, and refugee student grants. So the English as a second language and francization grant is based on assessments that we do in the school, and we do those every year. Something that to note about that is after 5 years, the funding does not continue. So even though a student is assessed in their 6th year as still not proficient in English, the school will continue to support, but the funding does not continue. And the funding for this is based on the number of English language learners, their weighted moving average, multiplied by $1,200. Very similar for the refugee student grant. This is to help them with additional language, social, and educational supports. We take the number of refugee students in the weighted moving average, multiply it by $5,500. And again, for the refugees, they are only funded up to 5 years. So this is very important when it comes to documentation, because if we don't have the correct documentation, then we don't get the funding to support the students. Do we still support the students? Yes, we do, because we're teachers and our job is to support the students. But do we get the funding for it? No. As we speak, 48% of our students are not at grade level, and they are funded for ESL. The very last piece of the pie is First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in this category. And you can see in front of you that it's made up of 3 parts. So a proportional allocation is based on the overall student population to acknowledge those recommendations that were made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and to support related activities. So that's for all the students. So it's a provincial total that they get for Truth and Reconciliation support multiplied by a proportionate share of weighted moving average, and then adding a provincial allocation factor in there, which wasn't clear. Okay, so that's how they factor in the first piece. The second piece is a component based on self-identification. So students who self-identify as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit when they register, those are noted in the system so that we can tell Alberta Education we have this many self-identified as a part of our weighted moving average. They will multiply it by $1,200 and we get funding to support the students in that way. And then the third component is a component based on the census and the self-identification data. And we get that, I believe that comes from the 2016 census, but don't quote me on that. I've seen that for other pieces of this document, so I'm just guessing on that. So they basically will look at the total allocation, multiply it by the division's share of the weighted moving average, factoring self-identification, and the First Nation Métis Inuit census population. Okay, so we are done the pie that talks about supports and services. In another session, I can dig deeper for you. But for today, I want to focus on where does the money come from. The next piece of pie is about the school. And this is not about the school and so much what's in it, as it's about the operations and maintenance of it and the transportation of students. So this grant was actually increased this year by 1.046%, which is actually not that much if you remember the piece of pie for transportation was quite small. So 1.046% of what we were already getting only works out to about $46,000, which is peanuts. That's less than the cost of an educational assistant, and it's not quite enough for a bus. So the operations and maintenance grant will make sure that the schools are safe and well maintained. It also includes funding for the superintendent. Transportation focuses on transportation, of course. A bus, just for your information, and I can go into details on this another time as well. One bus costs about $70,000 a year to operate, no matter how many students are on it. It's not about how many students are on it. But if we can fill the bus, then we're getting bang for our buck. We have some buses, like I mentioned, for the special needs programs that aren't that full, but they're still costing us $70,000. So in a year, we spend about $2.1 million on transportation, and we are only funded for $1 million. And we'll get into the details later. I just want to throw out some of these numbers at you as we go. So the next piece of the pie is community, and it gets sliced up into 3 different pieces. These grants are designed to address our context, where we live. And so the first grant is the socioeconomic status grant. And this is allocated based, and there's where I saw the census thing. This is based on the 2016 census data for these categories: the mother's education, lone parent households, home ownership, average income, and parents' post-secondary education. So they're actually looking at the socioeconomic status of Fort McMurray. And they put us in a category and they weight it. And so when I looked up ours, our allocation is actually 1.08. So they would multiply the weighted moving average divided by the SES index of 1.08, which 1.08 is actually quite low because of where we live. Other places I saw were at 9 point something, 10 point something. But because we have a higher family incomes as an average, we have a lower allocation for this. The second category is geographic. And so basically they're looking at, where do you live? Are you north of the 55th parallel? Are you isolated? What facilities and services do you have close by? And so we are at the 56th parallel, so we get a little bit of grant money here for that matter. And finally, the nutrition grant. Basically looking at socioeconomic status index as well, and basing it on that and the weighted moving enrollment. Because we have more than 5,000 students in our system, we are getting $150,000. And that I can give you as a flat amount. So we take that $150,000 and we divide it amongst the schools accordingly for their breakfast program and or whatever nutrition program they need to use it for. Next piece of the pie is jurisdiction. And that has to do with system administration. This is stuff like board governance, which includes all the activities related to the board's work and operation of the elected boards of trustees. So things like their salaries and wages, their benefits, their per diems, their honorariums, or travel expenses, fees to go to attend professional development and conferences, etc., running their elections. But it also includes any staff in the division who are directly supporting them. So that would be the superintendent's office, myself, my communications coordinator, and my recording secretary. That would include the associate superintendent's office because he is the finance and business and finance guy. So him and one other director and their admin assistant, and then the assistant superintendent's office, which is the human resources office for herself, her admin assistant, and her director. So all of those are related to this grant. It also covers the costs for the building that we work out of. So we need to keep that in mind as well. There are other additional grants, and I will just name a few. They're not directly related to those pieces of pie that I talked about. These would be in addition to that. So we get home education and shared responsibility grants for our students in home education programs. We get grants for our outreach program, and we can apply for a federal grant for French. And this year we did because, any little bit helps. We got a federal French grant for Cole Dickensfield and McTavish of $124,000. It's not guaranteed, and every year, and we have to apply. And then Mr. Kalal wanted me to remind you that in addition to all of this, the government of Alberta, when they moved to this new funding framework, actually gave us something called bridge funding. And the bridge funding was meant to fill in the difference between the old framework for funding and the current one, because they didn't want anyone to suffer and they didn't want to have any large drops in revenue in implementing it. So they gave us $4 million, which we call bridge funding. And this is actually 5% of the total funding we get. And we don't know what we're going to do when that goes away, because we, even with the bridge funding, are underfunded. Are you seeing a theme here? That's correct. The theme is underfunded. So where do we put all of these funds? The Board of Trustees makes fiscally responsible decisions of where the money goes. And so looking just at this chart, just at the purple, because that's what I've been talking about, is what Alberta Education has given us. This is where we put it into. Schools gets the bulk of the Alberta Ed dollars, sorry. Student Services gets a little bit. There's a category called pooled, and you're like thinking, what the heck is pooled? We don't have any pools. We used to have a pool. We don't have any more, but that's not what it's about. This is stuff like our Student Services Department, who takes care of all of our Power School stuff and more, connecting with Alberta Education to make sure our funding is all backed up by data through all the information that we get from students. It also includes their cost of living allowance for staff. It includes the Alberta Teachers Retirement Fund contributions that we have to make on behalf of teachers. And any teachers that are getting paid that are on long-term leaves, their money comes out of here. And there's more, but that gives you an idea. These first three bars essentially are related to the instructional piece. Then we have the operations and maintenance, transportation, and system administration. And you'll see, and more amortization isn't purple. We'll talk about that another time. I just wanted you to see where this all goes. And another way of looking at it in a donut shape, we have targeted and other revenues. So you can see some of the things we've already been talking about, but the targeted revenues is this green part, and you can barely see, there's some white lines there, but this whole green area basically is targeted. revenues, because we know we have to have COLA, and we know we have to have busing, and we know we're going to need to give ESL support. Okay, so these are all definitely targeted. And so if you were to look at our revenues versus our expenses, and I apologize that this is so small, this is actually from a document that you can pull off of our website under the board, which is our budget schedule for August 31st of this year. The top half is revenues. You can see right at the top there, it says revenues, and then the bottom half is expenses. And by looking at our budget and our revenues and our expenses that were approved by the board, you can see we never have enough funds and we have to go into a deficit. And the only savings that come out of this is through admin and governance, which is under system administration. If I go right down to the bottom, operating surplus deficit, that's that very last line in each column. If it's in brackets, or parentheses, that's because it is a deficit. So for instruction, for example, these are the revenues, 9.5 million. This is for kindergarten. The expenses are 9.7 million. And so we are at a deficit of $250,000. And this is including more than just what Alberta Education gives us, but I just need you to understand where the deficit comes from. For grade 1 to 12, our revenues are at 56 million. Our expenses are at almost 58. So that's a deficit of 1.5 million. That's those students that we talked about that we're unfunded for. Imagine. And then we see everything. So when we get to system administration, you're thinking, well, how come that one's not in a deficit? We've done some cutbacks. We've cut back some positions over the years at district office, and we continue to do that. So also, though, there is a gray area here. This gray area is where the ministry gave us permission to use some of our rental income and interest income. Otherwise, it would be a deficit. So this kind of wraps it up for you on where all that money goes. Where it comes from, where it goes, in a big picture kind of way. We also have a different kind of funding called capital funding. We might receive capital funding for projects that Alberta Ed approves for us. We have to apply for this. There's a process. And this would be for things like new schools, additions to schools, or modernizations to existing schools, and or the replacement of an entire school, which I hope we never have to do. Sorry. We have to submit a plan to Alberta Ed by April 1st to do any of these things. And it has to be part of our 3-year capital plan, which is also on our website if you're interested in seeing. When we want new portables, we have to go through a process. And if you've been to Dickinsfield, Christina Gordon, or McTavish recently, you'll notice that they're either getting ready to put in new portables or have taken off some old ones and replaced them already. So there's some work happening in that area in the division. The board has the responsibility to manage the facilities. And so that is where we talk about infrastructure maintenance and renewal and capital maintenance and renewal. They need to make sure that the buildings are all safe and caring and that they're following all the regulations for safety. Then we have operating funding, which is for infrastructure maintenance and renewal. And finally, we have the capital maintenance and renewal. So these could all be different things related to capital funding. We have school generated funds. So if you're on a parent advisory group, you know that you are a society that can raise money for your school. And so that would be considered a school generated fund. But the schools can also do their own fundraising, and they do that all the time. And that would be for things that they might need that are above and beyond the regular curriculum that would not be covered in the budget. Maybe I want to go on a grade 6 field trip and there's no money in the budget for it, so we would do some fundraising. There are also some schools who rent out their gyms to get extra funds, and they can use those funds as they see fit. The only rule is with this and donations, it has to be spent on students. You can't be buying your staff tracksuits with school-generated funds. The school-generated funds are for the benefit of students. And so, I want to keep you coming back for more. And so I'm going to stop for today. I don't want you to burn you out with all this data. And I didn't want to make it too complicated either to turn you off, like I said. So next day, we'll start on the rest of the list. What does it get spent on? What's our budget? I'm going to talk about salaries of teachers and salaries of educational assistants. How do we focus in on the facilities, instruction, and other things? How is the money allocated to schools once it comes to the division? So we'll talk about the school budget lines. We'll talk about special needs assessments and priorities. We'll talk about what are operating reserves, because we have something like our rainy day fund. And we'll talk about how we're paying down our deficit. And one thing of particular interest to some people might be the calendar. How does the calendar affect the budget? So if you have any other ideas that might arise or questions as well, keep them coming. So that is it for what we're going to present about the budget today. As I mentioned, we will come back and do more on the budget. I just didn't want to overwhelm you today with too much information. Appreciate you being here. Don't forget about the links at the bottom of the screen below this film or this video. You will see a link to a Google Doc, which is where you can ask questions. And then the second link is provided for you, and that is our thought exchange, where you can go and we can continue this discussion. And that will be open for a period of time, not just tonight. So you can keep going back to it and seeing what people say, and you can respond as well. So once again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time.